So tonight, you guys, we're going to be going into the Gospel of John. But before we do that, I wanted to show you something as we've discussed a lot of things relative to the Gospels. We've discussed the origins of the Gospels, the oral tradition, how perhaps they were assembled through oral tradition. We've discussed literary dependence, maybe how Matthew and Luke used Mark literarily. But we've also discussed how the Gospels were put together. I find that stuff interesting, don't you? I feel like it's detective work. That the Gospels were notably put together, probably most critically, by interviewing eyewitnesses. I don't know if you found it interesting how oral tradition worked and how it was safeguarded and maybe how it was elaborated a little bit and then how it was put together. But I don't know if those discussions stimulate you like they stimulate me, but I love history, and I love, especially in cultures like that were the first century, Second Temple Judaism period was primarily an oral culture because the literacy rate was, they think, Catherine Hetzer, 3 to 7%. And so how do you teach when people are illiterate? You memorize and you tell stories. And so ironically enough, they were probably way better with memory than we are, is because that's how they learned. And in our culture, you don't need memory. You got that. And if you ever want to look anything up or find anything, you have this, you also have books. Well, they didn't have that. So they had their memories probably, like muscles that you work your muscles, they get a little bit more defined. And so their memory probably was sharper than ours. And so my contention is that the Gospels, I do think Matthew and Luke used Mark, and the reason I think they used Mark was because it was known that Mark's Gospel, the source behind Mark's Gospel was Peter. And so there was a high degree of reverence, I believe, for Mark's Gospel when it was first written because it was looked upon as the preaching and teaching of Peter. And so I think they used it literarily as a source. But Matthew and Luke probably used Mark, but they also had other sources too. Do you remember what those were called? Matthew and Luke have material that's peculiar to Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark or John. Do you remember what that source was called? What the scholars call that source? They call it Q, which comes from Quelum, which means source. Sermon on the Mount would be an example of that. It doesn't correspond perfectly because Luke calls it the Sermon on the Plain, where Matthew calls it the Sermon on the Mount. The material is the same, but there's differences in wording, like because Jesus starts in the Sermon on the Matthew 5, the Sermon on the Mount, he says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," where Luke doesn't say that. He says, "Blessed are the poor." He doesn't have an in spirit. I know. Here's my favorite student over here. So my contention is that there was literary dependence on Mark, but I think there was way more going on because the form critics and the way I was educated in terms of the gospel origins and gospel history, primarily I was educated to think that it was a literary dependence, like they have the documents and they copy it and they'll add to it. I think there was literary dependence, like I said, because of the primacy of Peter. But I also think, and Luke tells you this, right? In Luke 1, he tells you where he gets the information for his gospel. What does he say in Luke 1? As it was handed down to us who were witnesses and eyewitnesses and servants of the word. And so they did go around and they interviewed, right? And so I think it's much more an oral dependence than it even is a literary dependence. So I think that for example, Mark 15, it says, Simon of Cyrene carries Jesus' cross, the father of Alexander and Rufus. It says that. Well, who's Alexander and Rufus? We don't know. Richard Bauckham, I brought the book tonight, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. This should be in your library of Cambridge University. Bauckham says that that's the ancient writer's way of footnoting. When he cites a name, because have you ever wondered when you read the Gospels, it's like, well, why does that person get a name? Why does Bartimaeus, there's a blind guy named Bartimaeus and he's named, but then there's other blind guys, they're not named. There's lepers that aren't named, but then there's people that, that Jairus gets named and raises his daughter from the dead. But the widow's son in Luke 13, she doesn't get a name. But then when Jesus raises Lazarus, Lazarus gets a name. And then you'll find it's also really weird that when Jesus gets arrested, do you remember what happens in the Garden of Gethsemane when he gets arrested? It starts to turn violent. And it says that Jesus' disciples cut the ear off of someone. But in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it doesn't name the person. The person that gets their ear cut off is anonymous. But then, by the time you get to John's gospel, it says it's Malchus. He gets a name. Well, that's weird, isn't it? It could be that they're drawing on the gospel writers are drawing on the same story, but from different eyewitnesses. Here's another one that's weird. What happens to Jesus right before Good Friday? Remember, he's anointed in Bethany. Remember the woman who anoints him in Mark's gospel? And it's in all the gospels. And Jesus even says, whenever the gospel is proclaimed, her name will be remembered. She's unnamed. I mean, until John's gospel, and you find out, oh, it's Mary of Bethany. Okay, we know it's her, but what a weird statement to say, wherever the gospel is proclaimed, her name will be remembered, and she doesn't get a name. I mean, that's highly bizarre. Do you know what Bauckham says, and other scholars say why the same event, like the anointing of Jesus at Bethany, the person who does it is unnamed, and then all of a sudden, later on in John's gospel, if that's the last gospel that's written, right, in 90 AD, she gets a name. So why does she? I just think it's so weird. Wherever the gospel is proclaimed, her name will be remembered, but I'm not going to tell you who it is. I mean, it's highly bizarre. But then in John's gospel, chapter 12, she's named. Okay, why is it? Bauckham says it's protective anonymity. Protective anonymity. What does that mean? When the Gospel of Mark and perhaps Matthew and Luke were written, Bauckham's contention is that she was still alive. It's basically a witness protection program. That's exactly right. She was still alive. By the time John's Gospel is written, she's dead, so you could say her name now. Whereas Malchus, he was probably still alive by the time Mark's Gospel is written. By the time John's Gospel is written in 90, 95, he's dead, so now you could say his name. Whereas if you would have just said their name in perhaps the 60s when Mark was writing, and we know that Christians are being persecuted and killed throughout the Roman Empire, it's like, you know what it is? It's like outing people. What's that? Yeah, it's doxing them. That's exactly right. And so this is protective anonymity. But it's fascinating. The other thing I want to talk about before we dive into John is this. And I think this is derived from your gospel writers' unintentional coincidence. So, what's a coincidence, you guys? You've never heard the term coincidence? Something that just happens where there's two dots that connect, and it's just like, oh, well, that's kind of coincidental, people say. The original usage of the term means not necessarily it just occurred and it was luck. The original sense of the term coincidence means that it's a coincidence. It means things are brought together inside, that there's an intentionality behind it. And unintentional coincidences. So you'll see this in all four Gospels. Unintentional coincidence. Well, okay, so before we look at, I'm going to have you look at 3 or 4 passages. What is an unintentional coincidence? Okay, let's say you're at work and your first employee comes in about 5 minutes late, and you say, hey, Bill, why are you late? And he says, well, I got in a car accident on the way here, and I hit this car, and the police had to come and blah, 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 but I finally made it to work on the corner of 26th and Jefferson, whatever. Second employee comes in about 15 minutes late, and he says, gosh, why are you late, Bob? I was driving to work, and he says, I got a flat tire because I was going by 26th and Jefferson, and there was a bunch of glass there, and I ran over it, and I got a flat tire. Granted that they're probably not colluding, which you could get with bad employees, right, as to why they're late. What does that look like? It looks like a unintentional coincidence, right, that adds up. Oh, the first witness didn't say that the car got hit and glass was everywhere, but it makes sense because the second guy who came in said there was glass everywhere, and which looks like, he didn't say there was a wreck, the second guy, but he said that there was glass everywhere. And the first guy said there was a wreck, but he didn't say that there was glass everywhere. But you can add those two up rather easily, correct? You have this in the Gospels all the time. And so think about it. If all four Gospels were written by single authors, which they are, and they interviewed sources, they interviewed eyewitnesses, you would expect that type of stuff, wouldn't you? You would expect unintentional coincidences. It's exactly what you get too. Now, when I was being educated in Bible, you were always taught not to combine the Gospels or to synchronize them, to put them together. Was this how you were taught down at Heretic Land, down when you got your doctorate? That each gospel is supposed to be taken on its own merit. You're not supposed to augment them with other gospel accounts. So Matthew was writing for a particular audience for a particular purpose, therefore you're not supposed to augment his account with stuff from John and stuff. You got to take them singularly. I think that's flawed.
I think it's the difference between a two-dimensional and a three-dimensional picture.
Mm-hmm.
You can only look at that one gospel in one way. That's your two-dimensional picture, but you bring everything together, you get a bigger, more beautiful,
Well, Athena, the way they did the reason they did this is because they thought the Gospels were primarily production of literary dependence. And so that means if Dan wants to write a gospel, well, I'm just going to copy Mike's, and I may supplement Mike's, and then, see, that's literary, I'm going to copy it. It's literary dependence. But what if the Gospels weren't comprised, as I said, solely just from literary dependence? What if they were comprised with literary dependence and historical investigation or interviewing? What if it was that too? Well, that would explain some of the differences now, right? So let's look at, I want to show you a couple of things. This is really interesting. And this may clear up, I'm sure you've had this experience because I still have it even today. And I've read the Bible, a lot, like we all have. But that doesn't really make sense. I don't understand this. So here, I'll have it up here for us. Let's look at 1 John 13, 2-5. So you see, I got it up here on the screen if you want to look, or you could look in your own Bible. So look at John 13, 2-5. So where are we at in John's chronology? This is the Last Supper. This is the night before Jesus' death. John's gospel is weird because John's gospel does not even include the Lord's Supper on the night before Jesus' death. John's gospel has something that the other three don't have, which is what? John has an upper room meeting the night before Jesus' death. Matthew, Mark, Luke, they have an upper room meeting. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have the giving of the Lord's Supper, which is the Holy Communion. John does not. What does John have that they don't have? Well, John has this weird foot washing scene. And you'll see, actually, there's a lot of churches in what's called Holy Thursday or Maundy Thursday, the day before Good Friday, where they will do foot washing. Have any of you ever experienced that? I think it's really cool. But watch, you're going to see this. I'm not washing anyone's feet. You guys could go ahead and do that. And now, especially feet in the Middle East in the first century that probably haven't I can't look at my Kim, our three boys, our kids' feet at the end of the day are disgusting. I mean, not only do they smell like our bathtub, it doesn't look like they bathed themselves when you look at the bath water after they get out. It looks like they took dirt and poured it in the tub. I mean, it's disgusting. So they have this foot washing. So look at verse 2. Do you see it up here, you guys? You got it? Got me? During supper, when the devil had already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from the supper. He laid aside his outer garments and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet and wiped them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, do you wash my feet? Jesus answered him, what I am doing you do not understand now, but afterward you will understand. Peter said to him, you shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered him, if I do not wash you, you have no share with me. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not only my feet, but my hands and my head. Jesus said to him, the one who is bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not every one of you. He's talking about Judas. Verse 12, when he had washed his feet and their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to him, do you understand what I've done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If then your Lord and your teacher have washed your feet, so you also have to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you'd also do as I have done to you. Truly I say to you, no servant is greater than his master nor a messenger, blah, 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 blah. But you get, okay, so what is Jesus doing here? Why is he doing this? He tells you why. Summarize it for me. I'm the Lord of the universe, and I'm doing the nastiest job. Therefore, my followers are not to be ones that are chest pounders and pride self-exalters, because if the king of the universe is going to get down on his knees and wash crap, therefore you need to live on your knees and be a servant rather than the one who is served. That's the lesson he's teaching here. It's like if you're at work and your boss is outside picking up trash, your boss now, who could fire you, your boss is picking up trash and you're like, ooh, I'm not going to pick up trash. It's like, if the big guy's doing it, it's not beneath you either. Right? So, yes, ma'am.
It's like Frosty always making the coaches do the serving and letting the players always go first. And the leadership always was at the back.
That's exactly it.
Teaching them to be servant leaders.
Football coach I played for in college would always have the coaches serving the food, and then they would eat last. That's exactly this. You'll see this also, crazy enough, in the Marine Corps. When you're out in the field. When you're out in the field, the youngest Marines, the most junior ranking Marines, they eat first. And the highest ranking Marines, the highest ranking officers, they eat last. So the highest ranking person to eat, the last person to eat out in the field with the Marines is the commanding officer. He's the last one to eat. Because if there's not, it's like a parent. The kids eat first, and if it just so happens that all the kids eat all the pizza and there's none left, you go without, not the kids. Right? And that's exactly how the Marines do it too. It's called Leaders Eat Last. So Simon Sinek wrote a great book when he was with the Marines, and he thought that was just amazing. Bless you. So here's the question though. We know the lesson Jesus taught with the washing of the feet. Why did he need to teach the lesson? You got to be careful in this front row because I spit too. Why did he teach the lesson? Why did he need to teach the lesson? Well, obviously, there must have been an ego problem that was afoot at this time. Obviously, Jesus is the omniscient Son of God. When he teaches for purpose, not just, hey, I just thought of something, guys. That's not how the Lord teaches. And so obviously there's an ego problem. But then you're like, well, I just read to you the whole beginning of the 13th chapter, and it doesn't say anything about that, does it? Nothing about the disciples having an ego problem. You just get this weird servant lesson in the middle of nowhere. Unless you look at Luke, the Gospel of Luke. Watch this, 22. Watch this. So go to Luke 22.
Who of us is going to sit on your right and your left?
Yeah, look at Luke 22. Don't preempt me.
Okay.
Don't read ahead. This is Luke's version of the same event that John records. But Luke doesn't have a foot washing scene. But look at what it says in Luke 24. So that both settings, don't look up there, look at me. Both settings are at the last or the night before Jesus' death, both of them. John has a foot washing, Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't. Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't have a foot washing. Okay, but look at this. What does verse 24 say right there? A dispute also arose among them as to which of them was to be regarded as the greatest. Oh. Now that makes a whole lot more sense, doesn't it? Why Jesus had to teach this. There was some ego stuff going on. John doesn't give you every bit of detail, and Luke doesn't. Luke gives you the reason for the foot washing, but not the foot washing, and John gives you the foot washing, but not the reason for the foot washing. Is that interesting? But now you know. Now we know why the Lord did what he did. Because look, it's an unintentional coincidence. Obviously, it's unintentional. Because John's just recording probably what he witnessed, and he doesn't even tell you why Jesus did what he did. He tells you why he did what he did. He doesn't tell you what occasioned him to do what he did. But you go to Luke and recording the same event, and you get it. You get the reason. I got some more. It's hard to tell why some gospel writers put some things in and don't and edit some other things. John tells you at the end of his gospel, he says this, quote, Jesus did many other signs and miracles that are not recorded in this book. In other words, what is John saying? I picked through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. I picked and I chose some things. Jesus did many other things that are not recorded in this book, but these are written down so that you may believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and by believing in him, you'd have life in his name. So there's obviously reasons, like if you sat down, if you were an eyewitness of the life of Jesus and you were going to sit down and write a gospel for a particular person, like Luke is writing a gospel for a particular man. So he has a man in mind as he's drafting it. His name is Theophilus. Well, obviously, if I was writing that, I was with Jesus, I would record things, or I would put together a lot of the traditions that maybe would speak to this man. They're true and they happen, but I'm putting stuff together, and maybe I'm picking things and not picking other things for Theophilus, which makes sense. Scholars say that Matthew wrote for a primarily Jewish audience, and so you see Old Testament citations all over the place in Matthew's gospel. You know, John, who knows? I mean, John's a little bit different. But ironically enough, you've heard me say this, John's gospel is the only one that internally, with the internal evidence, claims that it was written by an eyewitness. The rest of them don't claim that. And the titles, we know that at least 2 of the 4 were not eyewitnesses, Mark and Luke. They were not. But they said they interviewed the eyewitnesses. Anyway, check this out. Here's another one. So I'm going to go to Matthew 26. If you have your Bible, you could flip there too. This is Jesus, and Jesus has been arrested, and now the soldiers have control of him, and they're, you know what, this is right before his crucifixion, and it's not the scourging, but they're beating him up. So you remember this in Scripture where they'll put a purple robe on him. Why? They're making fun of him. Oh, you say you're a king, so let's put a king's robe on him. Oh, what else could we do to someone who thinks he's a king? Why don't we get a fake crown, right? And there's a crown of thorns on him. Oh, you say you're a prophet. Oh, well, why don't you prophesy? Bang, punch him in the face. Prophesy, who hit you? Watch, this is in Matthew's text. Check this out. So if you go to verse 67. So verse 67, do you see it up there? I have it right at the top. Then they spit in his face and struck him, and some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you?" Well, to me that's an odd passage, because if Russ Holtz, who's sitting right here, came forward right now as we're talking and punched me in the face, and if he said, "Why don't you prophesy? Who hit you?" I would say, "It's you. You hit me." Because I'm looking at you. So do you see how that's a little bit odd? When you read that on the surface of it, you'd be like, well, why are they telling Jesus to prophesy as if he couldn't see who was hitting him? Obviously, he knew who was hitting him. Luke tells us, or Matthew tells us right here. I mean, yes, but check this out. But if you go to Luke 22, so go to Luke 22 and go to verse 64. I'll get it for us right here. I should use this on Sundays. This is so much better than like handing out all those pieces of paper that I do every Sunday. Look at verse 63. I got it right up here. You see, Jesus is mocked. Look. Now the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him as they beat him. So this is Luke's telling the same event that Matthew's telling right now. They were holding Jesus in custody, were mocking him, and they beat him. They also blindfolded him and kept asking, prophesy, who is it that they struck you? Oh, that's why they're saying prophesy. That's why it makes sense now in Luke 22. Prophesy who hit you. He was blindfolded. Luke doesn't say he was blindfolded. Oh, that makes sense now when you piece that stuff together. What do you have? An unintentional coincidence. Let me show you another one. Isn't this fun? The most common one that I like to highlight, the feeding of the 5,000. Now that's told, you've heard me say this, right? How many Gospels is that told in? 4. So Matthew 14, and let's begin in verse 13. I'm just going to read it really quick, okay? So just eyes up. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. You're talking too fast. You need to listen fast. Verse 15, now when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, this is a desolate place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go into the villages to buy food for themselves. But Jesus said, they need not go away. You give them something to eat. They said, we have only 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he said, bring them here to me. Then he ordered the crowds to sit down in the grass, taking the 5 loaves, blah, 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 blah. Verse 21, those who ate were about 5,000 men and women, 5,000 men not counting women and children. Okay, here's what's interesting. Matthew doesn't tell you where this happened. He just says what? A desolate place. So we don't really know when Matthew's talking about the feeding of the 5,000, you get the miracle, but you don't get the locale. You don't get the location. But what's fascinating, check this out. In Luke chapter 9, here, I'll go to it for you right here. In Luke chapter 9, beginning in verse 10. Here's Luke's version of the same story. Verse 10, on their return, the apostles told him that what they had done, and he took them and withdrew apart to a town called... Oh. Now, we didn't know that from Matthew. And Matthew talks about the grass, right? Do you know all 4 Gospels talk about the grass at the feeding of the 5,000? And you know what else John tells us about the grass, which we're going to look at in a minute? It's greener on the other side. The grass is green, he says. Oh, which means it's probably spring. You see how you can start to add these things up? And so look at, we're in Bethsaida. So we got green grass. The miracle takes place in where? Bethsaida. You know where we get the name for our hospital, the military house, Bethesda. Okay, here's another interesting tidbit. Let's go over it's Mark that says green grass. Let's go to John 6. Kim, aren't you studying this tomorrow?
Yes.
So look at, so here's John's what's that?
We have a reader discussion today on it.
Oh, good. So look at, after this, Jesus went away to the other side this is John's version of the same story. After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Okay, so we got some more information. We're on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, Sea of Tiberias, which ironically enough, if you pull up a map, pop, there's Bethesda. And a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Oh, which explains green grass. Does it not?
Spring.
Because it's spring. But we don't have that information from the other 3 Gospels. Only in John that we hit, it's Passover. Oh, now it makes sense why Mark said the grass was green. What are these, gang? There's your UC, your unintentional coincidences. Look at verse 5. Lifting up his eyes then and seeing the large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to who? Who does he say this to? Jesus says to Philip. That's random. Why Philip? He's in the Gospel of John and virtually non-existent in the other three. So he says to Philip, look at what he says. Where are we to buy bread so these people may eat? And I love this because Jesus is obviously toying with them. He is. John's Gospel says Jesus is toying with them. There's a couple of instances in the Gospels where Jesus kind of has a wry grin off the side of his face. This would be one of them. There's another one. Luke 24:13-35, Cleopas on the road to Emmaus. And remember, Cleopas says to the risen Christ, and they don't recognize in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened. And Jesus goes, what things? He knows, right? So he says to Philip, which is weird, where are we to buy bread so these people may eat? He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. So this tells you that he's messing with Philip. I love that the good Lord messes with us. I love that the good Lord maybe laughs at us from time to time, right? You get a little bit of a sense of humor here out of him, I think. I mean, you could read it another way, but I tend to read it sometimes when you see the dumb cluck disciples and us, I bet he's going, ha, 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 ha. Look at verse 7. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, there's a boy here with 5, but we didn't know that before. Now there's a boy, we're told that there's a boy with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. Okay, so here's the question. Why does he ask Philip? I'll show you. That was rhetorical, Dr. Michael Adams. If you go back to John chapter 1, so if we just rewind 5 chapters, and you go back to chapter 1, you're going to see something about Philip when he's first introduced. Look at verse 44. Underneath, Jesus calls Philip and 43. The next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. Now, this is 5 chapters earlier. He found Philip and said to him, there's the first time Philip occurs. Follow me. Verse 44. Now, Philip was from... Oh, this is your hometown. This is your turf. Oh, so now we know why Jesus talked to Philip. Because he's from Bethesda. Bethesda. Oh, now this makes sense. What is this, you guys? These are unintentional coincidences. But when you start to put the stuff together, you start to realize, oh my gosh, this obviously isn't intentional, because if they wanted to make the coincidences intentional, it'd be way more overt. We're hunting for these things right now. If it was intentional, we wouldn't be hunting for them. They'd make it, it'd be on the marquee. You'd understand. You'd see it. They're hard to find, which means that they're just telling you what happened. And so do you see how you could start to build things like this? Maybe we'll do I have one more?
Do you think there's a little bit of a deeper message in that too? Like Philip's the planner, he'd be the one to organize and know where things are at and how much things cost. And maybe God wanted him to see that, guess what, there's some things you can't do on your own, that you have to...
Oh, I think that's a theological meaning to it. What I was doing was just showing you how authors interview eyewitnesses, put a story together. Another author interviews other eyewitnesses who were there, puts a story together. Another author interviews other eyewitnesses, puts a story together. Another author interviews maybe the same eyewitnesses, but 10 years apart now, and puts a story together. And you could take these seemingly insignificant details and put them together and answer a lot of questions because I've always asked, why did he go to Philip first? That's what I thought. But John's gospel tells us twice now he's from Bethesda. But John's gospel doesn't tell us that the feeding of the 5,000 was in Bethesda. You only get that from Luke. You see? I think this is I'm goosebumping.
When you go someplace to another city, it's not my church. What's the first thing I ask people?
Yeah.
Good place to eat.
Correct.
Where can I get food?
Yeah. No, ¿dónde es el baño? So watch this. Here's another one, last one. Matthew 14, the death of John the Baptist. Verse 1, at that time, Herod the Tetrarch, okay, we know who Herod is, right? He's the one who ends up beheading John the Baptist. Herod the Tetrarch, do you remember why? Because he married his brother's wife, and John the Baptist called him out on that. But Herod was a little bit scared of John, and then Herod had a perverted moment when he sees his wife, Herodias' daughter, dancing, and he's like, oh, I'll give you anything, even up to half of my kingdom. And she goes, and she had obviously colluded with her mom because her mom hated John the Baptist. And when Herod says, I'll give you anything, in his totally perverted, thinking with his genitals moment, he said, and I'm serious, that's all it is. The Bible doesn't hide warts, so I'm not going to either. He says, I'll give you up to half my kingdom. She goes, the head of John the Baptist on a platter, right? Well, check this out. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus. This is Matthew now, and he said to one of his servants, this is John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead. This is why these miraculous powers are at work in him. So my question, when I read that, Matthew obviously interviewed that Herod had with one of his servants. How does he know that? How does he know Herod said that? That's where my mind goes when you're doing gospel investigative work like we're doing. Well, Dick, say that louder for everyone else.
He had an insider.
Because it says here, look at verse 2. What does it say in verse 2? Herod said to his servants. But Matthew doesn't tell us how he got the information. However, you guys, if you go to Luke, Gospel of Luke, I'll just bring it up right here. Verse 1, Luke talks about these women that follow Jesus. Look at verse 1. Soon afterward, this is Luke now, not Matthew, and not even talking about Herod. So Luke's not telling the same story here. It's a totally different story. Soon afterward, he went through the cities and villages, proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God. And the 12 were with him, and also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out, and Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager. Oh, that's where we got the story. Because it says in Matthew, what does it say? Herod told his servants. Well, that means that dude. And here's his wife. And she's with Jesus right now. And that's your source from where you get the story. Now it makes sense. What is that called? An unintentional coincidence. These are all over. We could go through the stuff with Paul in the book of Acts, because you'll notice in the book of Acts, Paul, I'm going to send Timothy, I'm going to blah, 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 blah. And then you could look at Paul's letters and see how it corresponds. It's fascinating. Point is, the reason I bring this up, and the only reason I bring this up is, well, there's 2 reasons. Number 1, I think it's really cool. Number 2, it shows reliability of the text you're reading, right? You see what I'm saying? Does that make sense what I'm saying, you guys? It shows that the text is reliable because they're stumbling into truth unbeknownst of one another. They're independent of one another, and you're getting information which puts the puzzle together like perfectly. Unbelievable. Any points, questions, comments? I got 15 minutes. Anything, you guys?
It just makes it all seem more believable, because none of it was, like you said, if they were more overt, they were scheming to make something.
Yeah.
Now it's like taking 2 different authors and finding that the data is accurate because of completely different reasons.
Yeah, like liberal scholars like Bart Ehrman would say, well, you can't do that. You're like doing like synchronizing stuff and you're putting it all together. It's like, I agree you shouldn't do that if the Gospels were solely a product of literary work and literary dependence. If he's right on that, which I don't think he is. But if it's the Gospels use literary sources as well as oral sources that they interviewed, you very much can talk about this stuff. Does that make sense? Okay. John's Gospel. Because we only have a couple more sessions left. And I want to get through chunks of, mostly what I wanted to center on in these whole 10 weeks is Jesus' death and his resurrection. But I want to get into some of the other things that the Gospels talk about. John's Gospel, probably the last one written. written, it's ascribed the name John, but the name John isn't in the Gospel of John, right? So there's other theories. I gave you my theory of authorship, did I not, of John's Gospel. We just know that whoever the doggone beloved disciple is, that it first appears in chapter 13, we're told in chapter 21 that he's the author. He has written them down. So whoever that guy is. And they're like, some scholars, there's no way a Galilean fisherman or someone who in a culture that had a 3 to 7% literacy rate could have written in the style and form of Greek that John's gospel is written in. He would not have had, that's the Greek of someone who's highly educated. And no Galilean fisherman would be able to write like that. Which I would say, maybe so. Maybe so. However, that's not always the way people wrote. That if Dan's going to write, he takes pen and paper and Paul does this. How does Paul write Romans? Does Paul actually pen the letter to the Romans? He does not. Right at the end in chapter 16, when Paul's greeting all the people in Rome, there's one line in Romans that Paul did not author. And it's the guy who was scribing for Paul. And he says, I, Tertius, who write this letter with my own hand, send my greetings. So, and you know, I've researched this. I'm like, okay, so was that a kind of a customary thing that authors did? Yes, they did. We know that the greatest historian of the first century, who was not a Christian, Josephus, used scribes to improve his Greek and improve his language because Greek was not his native language, and he wasn't highly fluent in Greek. Furthermore, but you may be asking, Dan, in chapter 21, it says, this is the disciple who testified to these things and has written them down. It says he wrote them down. That doesn't necessarily mean he physically wrote it, you guys, because previously in John's gospel, Pilate wrote, this is the king of the Jews. It says Pilate wrote, this is the king of the Jews. And they said, we don't want it written above his head that have the sign say this man said he was the king of the Jews. And Pilate responds by saying, I have written. I have written. Pilate didn't physically write it. What is he saying? No, but he takes responsibility for the writing. So it could be very much the fact that John, the author, dictated the whole gospel. Now, here, let me blow your mind even more. John's gospel, 21 chapters. Here, I'm just going to go through it really quick because we got to move. John's gospel, 21 chapters, 7 miracles. But John doesn't even call them. He calls them semeions in Greek. Signs. 7 signs. Right? What are the 7 signs? Can anyone name a couple? What? You all know the first one. It's the party miracle. What's the party miracle? What's the first miracle in John's gospel? Water into wine. And you may say, well, that was just Jesus being good to his mommy. No, it wasn't. Says to her, woman, what is this to me? My hour is not yet come. And anyway, he ends up doing it. But if you go read throughout the prophets, you will see that a sign of the kingdom coming, a sign that God's kingdom has arrived, is a number of the minor prophets in the Old Testament will say, new wine will drip, new wine will come, new wine, new wine, new wine. And Jesus' inaugural miracle in John's gospel is he brings new wine. Meaning that just, oh, my mom wanted me to do something. I think I'll do it for her. It's way bigger than that, you know. And notice in John's gospel, he calls them signs because he doesn't call them miracles. He calls them signs because signs are the purpose of a sign is to do what? To point to something else. So, and you will see when Jesus did this, it says many of his disciples then believed in him. Oh, okay. So the miracles are not there to dazzle. Like, look we could raise the dead and we could turn water into wine. We got a magic man on our hands here. They're not there for that. Jesus didn't multiply the loaves and the fish just to feed people. He says, you're only following me because you got fed. He says this in chapter 6, does he not? You're only following because you had your fill of the loaves. He says, if you really want your hunger satiated, he says, I am the bread of life. not the physical bread that I give you. I am the bread that has come down from heaven, right? See, so do you see, this is called classic Johannine misunderstanding. They're like, we want bread, we want to eat. And Jesus says, I'm the bread of life. I'm like, we don't get it. See, he's on a different level. Remember what he says to Nicodemus in John chapter 3, you have to be born again. And Nicodemus says, how can I get back into my mother's uterus? And Jesus is like, you're not getting it, right? You're on a different level. Woman at the well, if you'd asked me, woman, I would have given you living water. She goes, give me this water so I don't have to keep bringing my bucket out here to go in, and the well is deep. She's not getting it. You see what's happening? Your brother, Mary of Bethany, Jesus says to Mary of Bethany, she says, I know he will rise, Lord, on the last day. I am the resurrection and the life, right? He who believes in me, even though he dies, will live, and he who dies believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? I mean, so that's all over John's gospel, that classic misunderstanding. Jesus is talking about something here and using things, ordinary things that everyone would know, and elevating it to a godly level. You see? So there's 7 of those. And here's what's even crazier. They increase in intensity. The signs do. The first sign, turning water into wine. Pretty doggone cool. The last sign that Jesus does, the last miracle that he does, he raises Lazarus from the dead. Kim, you're in John 6 tomorrow, which is, I think, his third sign, which is multiplying the loaves and the fish, eating of the 1,000. Do you see how they begin? He just turned water into wine, and no one knew that Jesus did it except the wine steward in John 2. Right? And now feeding of the 5,000 is a greater intensification. And Jesus says it's the fulfillment of manna in the desert from Exodus. That's what God, I'm the true manna. And what is manna? Well, it's the true faith food. Because do you remember what would happen? God would give them the food in the wilderness. The people of Israel, it's the true faith food. Because you can't collect it. Do you remember? What would happen if they collected it, put it in their backpack, like, got manna for like 2 months right now? What would happen? It would rot. It would mold. And so what would you have to do if you wanted to eat? You'd have to wait on God anew every day. Oh, it's the ultimate faith food. You can't conserve it. You can't keep it. You have to wait for him to give it. Oh, man, alive. Jesus says, that's what I am. The man in the wilderness thousands of years ago was pointing to me. I'm the true bread that came down from heaven. Your ancestors ate manna in the wilderness and they died. But he who eats of this bread, which is my flesh, will never die and will never be hungry or thirst again. Isn't that wild? And so the miracles or the signs go in intensity. And by the time you get to the last one, you're raising Lazarus from the dead, which in John's gospel is one of the justifications that they bring forward as to why they want to kill Jesus, is because he raised Lazarus from the dead, which is very ironic. And they don't even deny that he did it. They just know that now that he did this, everyone's going to follow him, so we have to kill him. They're not even denying that he did it. So it's weird. And my teacher, I had a Johannine scholar, John Scholar at Luther Seminary, and he authored one of the Anchor Bible commentaries on the Gospel or on the Epistles of John. Have you ever heard the Sunday school kid said, "What are the epistles? Are those the wives of the apostles?" And the growing intensity of the miracles is showing the growing presence of God getting more powerful and more powerful and more powerful and more powerful till you're raising the dead. It's like God's kingdom through Christ is advancing, 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 advancing. And the more it advances, the more bitter the opposition gets. It's not that the more the people believe in him, it's more the hardened heart. It's hard. It hardens all the more. You'd think it's just the opposite. After he raises Lazarus from the dead, they're like, now we know we got to kill him. It's like, whoa. And furthermore, they say, and we also got to kill Lazarus too. They put a hit out on him as well. Now you know why we're back to anonymity when they were probably crafting these gospels. I always love chapter 12 because after Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, and how many days was he in there? 4 days. And remember, he goes, roll back the stone, and they go, Lord, I like the King James Version on this. It says, he stinketh. He stinketh, oh, he stinketh. And which is like, I would have been, if Jesus would have said that at the time, put yourself back in that situation. I would have been like, whoa, 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 whoa. This doesn't seem like something godly that's happening. This seems like an episode of The Walking Dead, a zombie movie. That's why when Jesus says, Lazarus, come out, and the guy comes out and he's still king-tutted. And he's, right? So that's why Jesus says, unbind him and let him go. And why do you think Jesus has to tell him that? Because if I were there, I'd be like, whatever the hell just came out of that tomb, I'm not getting near that. Stephen King wrote a horror novel based on stuff like this. It's called Pet Sematary. Right? And the ground has gone sour. Right? And so whatever comes back after it's been dead for 4 days, there's an old movie I watched as a kid with Kiefer Sutherland called Flatliners. Right? And whatever comes back doesn't seem like it comes back and it's all good. It seems like it's all bad. Well, so Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. You know, those are the 7 signs. And do you know what else, Jesus? And why is 7 important? It's the number of God. It's the number of completion. It's the number of wholeness. And Jesus also makes divine claims about himself in John's gospel, explicit divine claims. In the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus' divine claims are more by virtue of it's called a functional Christology. You could tell he's making God claims by the functions that he's doing. So for instance, he calms the wind and the waves. He has authority over nature. And what do the disciples say? Who is this? Who even the wind and the waves obey him. That's functional Christology. Only God could do something like that. But see, it's God's function, not necessarily identity, but the function is pointing to the identity. How about this one? Your sin is forgiven. Whoa, no one can forgive sins but God alone. Right. You see, that's a functional claim. It's functional Christology. It's not like explicit, like what Jesus says in the Gospel of John. Although you will find that in the synoptics. They're like, you can't do that on the Sabbath. You can't do that on the Sabbath. The Sabbath. It's the Sabbath. You can't do that on the Sabbath. And he goes, bro, I invented the Sabbath. Chill. Now that's my language. He says, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Well, that's more of an explicit ontological claim rather than a functional claim. There's other like raising the dead. Boom, that's divine. You know, and you'll see in the earliest Christian literature. Hey, this is fascinating. I don't know if I've ever mentioned this before. The earliest Christian literature that you have, remember, is the letters of Paul. And early on in Paul's writing, what would be my prize student over here? What would be the most famous creed that every Jewish boy and girl would know, that they would recite all the time, that would be, if you had to boil the Old Testament Judaism down to one sing-songy creed, what would it be? Hear, O Israel, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. You go to 1 Corinthians 8:6, check this out. You already have your minds blown again? I don't know, this blows my mind, that's what I think. Look at verse 6. This is Paul in 1 Corinthians. He says, yet for us there is one God, the Father. He's doing the Shema that every Jew would know, from whom all things and for whom we exist, and one Lord Jesus Christ, and through whom all things and through whom we exist. Jesus Christ has been added to the Jewish Shema. And notice that Paul's not saying that this is polytheism. In somehow or another, our monotheistic God that we worship, the identity of Jesus Christ, is now added to it. This is crazy. Okay, Jesus has 7 explicit divine claims in John's gospel. I gave you one, John 6, feeding of the 5,000. What is it? I am. Oh, why is that important? In Greek, ego eimi. When Moses asked God his name, what does God respond with? There. I am. And so Jesus, says, I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. Chapter 8. Chapter 6, chapter 8. Chapter 10, I am the gate for the sheep. Chapter 10 again, I am the good shepherd. Chapter 11, I am the resurrection and the life. Chapter 14, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Chapter 15, I am the true vine, and you are the branches. 7 I am statements. 7 signs, 7 I am statements. The number of God. Crazy. Now, before we go, let me give you something even crazier. Well, 2 things before we go. I may be a little bit over. I had a video to show them too. Maybe we could continue John next week too, because John's the one that last time we did Gospels I neglected the most, and it's actually my favorite gospel. Luke's up there too. I mean, we named our firstborn after the gospel, so Luke. But the gospel according to chance? Yeah, that's a Gnostic gospel. Check this out in John. So John, unlike the other gospels, although Luke has a prologue, John has an explicit prologue. What's a prologue, you guys? And John's prologue is from chapter 1, verse 1 through 18. It's called it's a prologue. He's not telling you any narrative. He starts, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing is in him was life, and that life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. I had a funny story at the gas station with that Bible verse with a girl, a young teenage girl. Remember I told you this? Her name was Zoe. And I go, oh! And I could tell she probably didn't want anything to do with Jesus. Right? Sometimes you're wrong on that. Sometimes the people that look like they don't want anything to do with Jesus are like nothing other than the people who hung around Jesus a lot when he was here. Right? So you got to be careful with that. But she really didn't look like it, because I think had satanic heavy metal shirt on. So I'm like, I think this is safe that it's not a Christian. But I could be wrong. So I said, oh, your name's Zoe. That's in the Bible. She goes, no, it's not. I go, yeah, it is. Show me where. I said, well, if I had to show you where, I'd have to teach you Koine Greek, which is what they wrote the original New Testament in. Would you like to know where that occurs in the Koine Greek? She goes, yes. I said, it's John chapter 1, when it says about Jesus, in him was life, and that life was the light of all people. And that word for life that John uses right there, Zoe. She goes, oh, well, I didn't know that. I said, yeah, you're right there, and you're closer to Jesus than you probably thought. Huh? But that's in the prologue. And the prologue ends in verse 18, where it says, no one has ever seen God. Right? John says this, but it is God, the Father's only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known. That's how the prologue ends. And which is weird, is you say, no one has ever seen God. That's weird, because Jacob wrestled with God. Didn't get a good look at him, but he wrestled with him. Enoch walked with God, right? Moses saw God. Elijah got taken up in a fiery chair. So what does he mean that no one's ever seen God? There's people that have kind of seen God. Isaiah had a vision of God. So what is he saying? Here's what John is saying. No one's ever seen his heart. You may have seen God. You may have seen like Moses did. In Exodus 33, where Moses says, Lord, show me your glory. And God says, okay, I'll come by. I'm going to put you I almost said the cartoon when I was a kid. Put you in the crag of a rock, and I'll let you see my butt. Seriously. God says, I'll let you see my backside. I got yoga pants on. I'll let you see my butt. Right? What does my dad call them? Yogurts. You got the yogurt pants. But the point is what is God saying? You can't see me truly. You're going to have to see my backside. And Martin Luther feasted on this, and he says, oh gosh, and guess what? When Jesus Christ comes, we see God, but we see him under the form of his opposite. Look at God as the author of life, and primarily where is he found? Hanging on a cross in death. God is perfect, and where is he found? With the sin of the world hanging on his shoulders. You're again seeing God's backside, but you're seeing his front side too there, Luther said, because you're finally, not just knowing that there is a God, but you're seeing his heart. And you see that in Jesus Christ alone. Prologue, and we'll end with this. Prologue has, does anyone know how many words in the Greek now are in John's prologue? 18 verses. 496 words in the Greek. 496 Greek syllables. This is fact. This is Bible scholar stuff. This isn't me making stuff up. 496 syllables of prologue. You have an epilogue too in John's gospel. .496 words. So, Richard Bauckham, this is in this text. That's why I said you should own it. And this is not some quack scholar that you have people at your church saying, you should really read this book. You know, it was really impactful for me. It's like, no, these are not like, the next best purpose-driven life book. This is like scholar, hardcore. He's the chair of the Christian history department at Cambridge. So there's 496 words in the epilogue. And what's fascinating is Bauckham says any author would have known that. Well, why would he have known that? Because they were why do you think he made sure that why did he edit it to the point, through the Holy Spirit, but why did he edit it to the point that there were 7 signs, there's 7 I am statements? Why does he put the miracles in a growing order of intensity like this? The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not overcome it. Why is it that the whole gospel, if you read the prologue, verses 1 to 18, it basically tells the story of the whole gospel, but in miniature? It's weird. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was with the Word of God. All things came into being without him. In him was life, and that life was life from all people. And it has a bit of narrative in it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though he made the world, yet the world did not know him. Now you're seeing opposition to Jesus. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not receive him, it says. But to those who did receive him, John says, who believed in his name, he gave the power to become the children of God, children who were born not of the will of man, nor of the will of the flesh, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory. There's your first example of eyewitness testimony. And that Greek word for see that he uses is not horao, which is like, look, there's Russ. That's seeing. There's another word for see that you use in the Greek. It's like when you see your spouse at the end of the aisle on your wedding day. It's like, it's more than just like, there she is. It's more like, oh my gosh, I see. It's more like this. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind. That's the type of seeing he's talking about. See that? Let me end with this. 496, you guys, is a perfect number. I didn't know what that was. How many of you know what a triangular number is? 3 would be a triangular number, right, Russ? Because it builds a triangle. You see? Yeah, so if you wanted to build another triangle, what would you have to do? Right? So that would be, 4, 6, 7. Triangular number. A perfect number is a number that when you take what it's divided by and add it up, it adds up to the number. So here, I'll give you quick what the perfect number, listing of perfect numbers are. 6 is a perfect number. What do you divide 6 by? What are the numbers you divide 6 by? 3, 2, and 1. What do you get? 6. So that doesn't occur until the next number is 28. What can you divide 28 by? Go from least to most. You could divide 28 by 1, 2, 4, 7, and 14, which adds up to 28. The next perfect number after 6, 28 is 496. You don't have one until 496. It's 628 and then 496. It's a perfect number. And Baucham's contention is that he feels that's intentional by the author, which ultimately is the Holy Spirit, right? And you have 496 in the prologue, you have 496 in the epilogue. What is the author saying? What is God saying through this? It's perfect from beginning to end. Now, I don't put a lot of stock in that. I just it gets me thinking a little bit at least. That's weird. It's perfect. The one that it contains. This is called an inclusio, or what you would call bookends. There's perfection to start, there's perfection to end, and the one that's in the middle between those two things is perfect.
And if you add 4 and 9 and subtract 6, it comes to 7.
Does it really?
4 plus 9 minus 6. 4 and 9 is 13, right?
Where's my? Hold on, let me read one more thing to you by Baucham. See, this is trippy, isn't it? But I don't get too much into the numerology stuff. But when the top like scholar in the world is referencing it. So listen, this is Baucham now. The prologue consists of 496 syllables, appropriately, since 496 is both a triangular number and a perfect number, and is also the numerical value of the Greek word monogenes, which means only son, used in John 1:14 and John 1:18. Odd though these considerations may be to us, people in the New Testament period were fascinated by certain special sorts of numbers, including triangular and perfect numbers. And he cites a secular source, first century historical source on this. But the importance of the number 496 for our immediate purpose is that it links the prologue and the epilogue together. For while the prologue has 496 syllables, the epilogue is considerably longer as 496 words. That the correspondence should be between the number of syllables in the prologue and the number of words in the epilogue is quite appropriate, because the prologue is a poetic composition in which one might expect the number of syllables to be important, whereas the epilogue is a narrative. Further evidence of numerical composition can be found in the fact that the two stages of the conclusion to the gospel, chapter 20, 30, 31, 21, 24 to 25, framing the epilogue, each consists of 43 words. For many other examples, he says, see Craig Keener. He's a Johannine scholar. I just have next to my words, I highlighted there, and I have weird. More Gospel of John next week, eh? Okay, thank you, Father. Thank you that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen His glory, the glory of the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. Thank you, Father, that we know that your Word says, the law came through Moses, but grace and truth came through your Son, Jesus Christ, who is perfect from beginning to end. And thank you that his grace is sufficient, your love is enough. And Father, I pray that we would leave tonight filled with peace, which passes all understanding, which will. In His name I pray. Amen.